Today, we are joined by author Glenn Taylor, whose book Finishing Strong explores the many challenges to ministry today and how these obstacles are not different in many respects from what the heroes of faith in the Bible experienced. So welcome, Glenn. Thank you so much for being here today.
It's a joy to be with you, Bill.
I love the title of your book, Finishing Strong. You know, and as I'm getting a bit older in leadership, I'm really curious about that. So how would you define finishing strong?
Well, I speak of premature attrition, and the alternative to premature attrition, which we see happening so frequently among pastors today, is finishing strong. And so we need the resources that enable us to do that if we're going to complete the job that God has called us to.
Okay, so premature attrition, that's a big term. What do you mean by that?
Well, a lot of my work has been with missionaries and also with pastors, and I would define premature attrition as the experience of someone who enters with enthusiasm into ministry, but then because of the obstacles, the stress, the pressure, drop out. It's like a high school dropout, as it were. So you don't finish the program. And what I wish to do is to help individuals to understand what will enable them to endure to the finish line, as the Apostle Paul speaks of that in his own life.
Yeah, now it's interesting because I agree. I'm a pastor, and so I see a lot of my friends who have experienced that. But I think it's across the board. I see also a lot of people who come to faith really excited about what God's doing in their life, and then somewhere along the way, they kind of lose their way. And you call it the wilderness experience in your book. So why do you think God allows us to go through these difficult or challenging experiences in our faith?
Well, it certainly are the wilderness experiences that often lead to people dropping out of ministry. And frequently that's a result of stress. It may be a result of conflict. It may be a result of difficulty, grumbling, the kind of things that Paul describes as characterizing the churches in the New Testament, which included moral failure, which included grumbling, backbiting, fighting, devouring one another. We have to address those issues, but we need a relationship with God that enables us to endure to the end, in spite of those tensions.
Well, I'm glad that you brought it up, because as a pastor, I do know on the receiving end of some of those things. And so maybe some of our viewers who do go to church, one of the simple steps, practical steps, is encourage your pastor, encourage your leaders. Now, you've obviously gone through some wilderness experiences. So how did you come out on the other end better rather than bitter?
Well, I could give you an illustration of that, maybe a couple of illustrations. One, the first pastoral experience I had in 1956 required me to commute from Toronto to Kingston to begin a church. And I was in seminary at the time. I was not able to sustain that and had pneumonia a few times and had to drop out. So dropping out was certainly a wilderness experience for me. Now, I returned to the pastorate when I finished my school year, but when a pastor has to drop out of ministry for whatever reason, that very much is a wilderness experience. Also, wilderness experiences may come as a result of health issues, but the resources that enable us to endure through those are extremely closely related to our relationship to God on the one hand, but our relationship to other believers as well.
Yeah, I agree. Well, and I think for our viewers, and many would be familiar with some of the challenges, of course, in the church world today, with some of the higher profile pastors leaving ministry. And so how would you encourage, people who are watching this to encourage their leaders to pray for their pastors who maybe are in a wilderness experience, whether they know it or not? What would be some advice you'd give?
Well, I think we need to gather around us people who are supportive. Moses would never have survived his experience of ministry without the presence of Aaron and without the help of Miriam. But central to that was the assurance that he received in his wilderness experience that God would be with him and would enable him. Endurance is inspired by hope, as the Apostle Paul points out so clearly. And it's also a result of God strengthening us, as we read about in Colossians and in Ephesians. Our strength for endurance comes from God. It's not a personality trait. It's something that we can increase by increasing our effective relationship with God, but also increasing what I would call a support replenishment system, which may involve the elders of the church. It may involve other people in the church. But that affirmation from others enables us to sustain and to persevere in the presence of the issues that come with wilderness.
Yeah, well, I know in my own experience, I have a group of people who pray for me regularly, and that is a huge encouragement to me. I have people in my life who, do build life and speak and kind of have my back, are champions with me, and I think sharing that vision is really, really important. And so, so for those watching, maybe you talk a lot about legacy and finishing strong, finishing well. What would you say to someone who maybe is either at the beginning of their faith journey or nearing the end of that? Some practical steps to make sure that you stay on the path and you finish strong.
Well, one of the things that I found very important in my counseling with scores of pastors is that they create a support team, I would call a spiritual care group, who will be there to encourage them, to affirm them, to help them to be accountable, to look at their spiritual life to see that they're sustaining themselves spiritually, look at their physical lives to know that they are sustaining themselves physically. Now, some of us are a bit adverse to exercise, but we know that health and well-being are tremendously important for endurance and sustaining ourselves emotionally. So we need the relational input. Paul needed Titus when he was discouraged in Macedonia. He was depressed, he was discouraged, he had fears from within, and he had conflict from without. And then Titus came along and comforted him. And without the comfort of Titus, Paul might not have survived his depression in Macedonia.
Yeah, well, that is just such great advice. If you want to grow in your faith, make sure you take care of yourself spiritually, emotionally, relationally, and physically. Thank you so much, Glenn, for being with us today. If you want to find more about his book, you can go to our website, and all the information will be there for you. Thanks, Glenn, for being here today.
It's been a pleasure talking to you, Bill.